By sunrise, the battery yard looked like it had been bitten open by the earth itself. A drilling rig leaned crooked in the mud, its steel tracks half swallowed. Yellow work lights blinked through the rain. Men in hard hats stood frozen along the fence line, staring at the brown water boiling up from beneath the pasture. No one was talking now. Not Calvin Price, not the county engineer, not the neighbors who had laughed when Ellen Whitaker warned them not to build there. Ellen stood in her old gray raincoat, one hand gripping the wire fence, her boots sunk deep in Kansas clay. The storm had soaked her white hair flat against her face, but she did not move. Then the ground groaned again. A perfect circle of old stones appeared beneath the mud. Ellen closed her eyes and whispered, "It found the old well." If you're watching from a small town, a farm road, or somewhere that still believes old stories matter, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories like this still mean something to you, consider subscribing before we go back to the quiet morning when all of this began. 5 months earlier, Cedar Hollow, Kansas, was still the kind of town where people knew a truck by the sound of its engine before they saw it coming. It sat low beneath a wide prairie sky, with one blinking stoplight, a white-steepled church, a grain elevator faded by sun, and a diner where the coffee tasted the same whether it was poured at 6 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. 3 miles south of town, down a gravel road lined with fence posts and Johnson grass, stood the Whitaker place. The farmhouse was white once, though years of wind had softened it into the color of old bone. The barn leaned slightly to the east. The mailbox had been dented by a snowplow 15 winters before and never replaced. Out behind the cattle lot, an old windmill turned slowly, even on days when there seemed to be no wind at all. Ellen Whitaker had lived there for 43 years. At 67, she moved slower than she used to, but not carelessly. Every morning, before the sun cleared the cottonwoods, she walked the fence line with a tin coffee cup in one hand and a pair of pliers in the other. She checked the wire, counted the old fence staples, looked at the low ground near the south pasture, and paused where the grass grew strangely green, even in dry weather. Most folks in Cedar Hollow thought Ellen was stubborn. They were not entirely wrong. Since her husband Ray died 6 years earlier, she had refused every offer to sell the farm. She had turned down neighbors, land brokers, and one polite man from Topeka who wore polished boots that had never touched mud. Each time, Ellen gave the same answer. "No, sir, this ground is not finished with us yet." Her son Luke hated hearing that. Luke lived in Wichita now, fixing commercial heating systems and raising 2 girls of his own. He loved his mother, but every visit ended the same way: bills on the kitchen table, the barn roof sagging lower, the bank calling more often, and Ellen pretending she was not afraid. First, Flint Bank had been patient, but patience had a limit. The tax bill was late. The hay shed needed work. The tractor Ray had loved sat under a tarp with one rear tire low and rust creeping around the hood. Still, Ellen stayed. Not because the farm was worth much on paper. Because Ray was buried on the rise behind the house, beneath a limestone marker he had cut himself. Because their daughters had taken their first steps on that porch. Because every inch of that place carried a memory Ellen could not pack into a box and move to town. And because of something hidden in the barn. Behind sacks of feed and a broken seed drill, beneath an old canvas tarp, leaned a wide cedar board no one was allowed to touch. Ray had carved it by hand years ago, burning thin lines into the wood with a heated nail. Ellen had not looked at it in months, but she knew what was on it. That morning, as she crossed the yard, a county truck rolled slowly past her mailbox. Then another. By noon, 3 orange survey stakes had been driven into the south pasture, bright as warning flags against the winter-brown grass. Ellen stood at the fence and stared. The stakes were placed exactly where Ray once told her never to put weight. The next evening, nearly half of Cedar Hollow gathered inside the old Grange Hall. The folding chairs had been pulled from the storage closet. A coffee urn hissed beside a plate of store-bought cookies. Farmers stood along the back wall with their caps in their hands, while county officials sat up front beneath a faded flag that had hung there since the 70s. At the center of the room stood Calvin Price from PrairieVolt Renewables. He was neat, calm, and confident, the kind of man who could make bad news sound like a scheduled improvement. Behind him, a projector showed bright blue panels stretching across a field, rows of battery containers, new access roads, and a clean digital map with no mud, no wind, and no memory. Calvin smiled at the crowd. "This project will bring Cedar Hollow into a stronger future," he said. "Construction jobs, long-term lease payments, county tax revenue, reliable, clean power. We believe this town deserves that." A few people nodded, some clapped. They had reason to. The hardware store had closed 2 winters ago. The high school football team barely had enough boys to dress on Friday nights. Families were selling land not because they wanted to leave, but because staying had become expensive. PrairieVolt's money sounded like rain after drought. Then Ellen raised her hand. Not quickly, not dramatically, just high enough that the room noticed. Calvin looked at her with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am." Ellen stood slowly. "Did your survey check below the old south pasture?" "Our engineers completed a full geotechnical review," Calvin said. "Soil density, drainage, satellite elevation, and ground-penetrating radar. That ground has holes under it." A few heads turned. Calvin paused. "We found no active sinkhole risk." "I didn't say sinkhole," Ellen said. "I said holes, stone wells, old water runs, ground that looks solid until it gets tired." Someone near the back let out a small laugh. Ellen did not look over. Calvin kept his voice kind, but his eyes had cooled. "Mrs. Whitaker, I respect local history, I do, but this project is based on current data. Data doesn't always know what got buried before data showed up. That time, more people laughed." Dale Haskins, who farmed 2 sections east, leaned toward another man and whispered loud enough for Ellen to hear. "Next, she'll be asking the windmill for permission." Ellen's face did not change, but her fingers tightened around the back of the chair in front of her. Near the side door, old Amos Bell cleared his throat. He was 84, thin as baling wire, with a voice that sounded like gravel under tires. "My daddy used to say Whitaker Hollow swallowed a mule team once." The room went quiet for half a second. Ellen turned sharply. "Amos." He lowered his eyes, as if he had said too much. Calvin clicked to the next slide. "The battery storage pad will be located on stabilized ground here, just beyond the Whitaker boundary. We have county approval pending final access and grading review." Ellen stared at the glowing map. The red rectangle marking the battery yard sat just south of her fence, near the cottonwood tree Ray had never allowed anyone to cut down. Her stomach dropped. After the meeting, Calvin approached her while people stacked chairs and talked about lease checks. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I know change can feel personal." Ellen looked at him. "This isn't about change." "Then what is it about?" She pointed to the map still glowing on the screen. "You're putting weight where the water used to breathe." Calvin studied her for a moment, then gave a careful smile. But Ellen was no longer looking at him. She was looking at that red rectangle. And for the first time in 6 years, she wished Ray were there to tell her whether she was brave enough to open the board. Ellen drove home from the Grange Hall with both hands tight on the wheel. The prairie was dark except for the thin silver line of her headlights moving across the gravel road. Every fence post appeared and disappeared like a memory. By the time she reached the Whitaker place, the windmill was turning slow above the barn, making its tired metal creak in the dark. She parked beside the house but did not go inside. Instead, she walked to the barn. The door dragged against the dirt when she pulled it open. The smell of old hay, dust, motor oil, and rain-stained wood met her like something alive. Ellen stood there for a moment, listening. A loose piece of tin tapped softly on the roof. Somewhere in the rafters, a sparrow shifted in its nest. In the far corner, behind feed sacks and a broken seed drill, the cedar board leaned beneath its canvas cover. Ellen took 3 steps toward it, then stopped. Ray had carved that board after the flood of 1978, back when they were young enough to think hard years would eventually run out. He had worked on it at night under a yellow shop light, burning lines into the wood with a nail heated over a propane torch. He never called it a map. He called it a reminder. "Land forgets nothing," he once told her. "People do." Ellen reached for the canvas. A truck turned into the driveway. She let the cover fall back into place. Luke Whitaker stepped out of his pickup wearing a work jacket with his company name stitched over the pocket. He looked tired before he even spoke. "Mom," he called, "you out here?" "In the barn?" He appeared in the doorway, broad-shouldered, 40 years old, with Ray's eyes and none of Ray's patience. "I heard about the meeting," he said. Ellen looked past him toward the yard. News travels fast. In Cedar Hollow, faster than weather. Luke stepped inside. "Dale called me." "Dale talks too much. He said you stood up in front of half the town and told a room full of engineers the ground was tired." "That is not what I said." "It's close enough." Ellen walked to the workbench and picked up a rag, though there was nothing there to wipe. "They're putting a battery yard over hollow ground." "Based on what, Mom?" She did not answer. Luke sighed and looked around the barn, at the sagging beams, the cracked concrete, the Ford 8N under its tarp with the low rear tire. "The bank called me again." Ellen's jaw tightened. "They had no right. They couldn't reach you." "I was busy." "You were avoiding them." That landed harder because it was true. Luke pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and laid it on the bench. "PrairieVolt is willing to pay for a drainage easement along the creek. It would cover the overdue tax bill and most of the barn loan." Ellen did not touch the paper. "They're not stealing from you," he said softly. "They're offering money we actually need." "We?" "Yes. We. Because when this place falls apart, you call me. When the bank calls, they call me. When you pretend everything is fine, I'm the one who has to guess how bad it really is." Ellen looked down. For one moment, she was not angry. She was just old and tired and ashamed of the stack of bills hidden in the bread drawer. Luke's voice softened. "Dad's gone. Mom, you don't have to keep proving you can hold all of this by yourself." Ellen turned away from him. On the wall, behind a dusty photograph of Ray standing beside the old windmill, a small brass key hung from a bent nail. Luke noticed it. "What's that for?" Ellen moved faster than she had all evening. She took the key off the nail and closed it in her fist. "Nothing important." Luke stared at her hand. Outside, the windmill gave one long groan. And beneath the barn floor, so faint, Luke did not hear it, Ellen heard the sound of water moving where no water should have been. By Monday morning, PrairieVolt had moved from promises to machinery. The first trucks arrived before 8, rolling past the Whitaker mailbox in a long line of white pickups, flatbeds, and diesel rigs with company logos on the doors. By noon, survey crews had crossed the south pasture beyond Ellen's fence, and a yellow bulldozer was pushing Johnson grass into rough piles along the low rise. Ellen watched from her porch with a coat over her nightgown and her coffee going cold in her hand. The sound carried across the farm like thunder that had learned to idle. She waited until she saw the foreman drive a steel marker near the cottonwood. Then she put on her boots, grabbed her old canvas field jacket, and walked down to the fence. "Don't wait there," she called. The foreman turned. He was young, red-bearded, and wearing a hard hat too clean for the work he was doing. "Ma'am, you need to stay behind the fence." "I am behind the fence." "This is an active work zone." "That's an old water run." He looked down at the ground, then back at her. "Looks like dirt to me." It always does at first. He spoke into his radio. 10 minutes later, Calvin Price arrived in a county SUV with Marla Jennings, one of the county commissioners, in the passenger seat. Marla had known Ellen for years. She had bought pies from her church booth, sent flowers when Ray died, and once let Ellen's granddaughters ride in the 4th of July parade. But that morning, she stepped out with a folder in her hand and worry on her face. Ellen, Marla said gently, you can't interfere with permitted site work. I'm trying to keep them from tearing open something they don't understand. Calvin adjusted his hard hat. We reviewed this location again after your comments. The compaction numbers are acceptable. The staging pad is temporary. Temporary weight can still break old ground. He nodded as if she had said something interesting, but not useful. I understand that you have concerns, but concerns are not evidence. Ellen reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded county drainage map from 1983. The edges were soft from years of handling. There used to be a ditch here, she said. North Relief Ditch. It carried stormwater away from the hollow. Marla looked at the map, then sighed. This isn't part of the official county drainage record anymore. That doesn't mean it stopped existing. It means we can't hold up a county-approved project over an unofficial line on an old paper map. Ellen felt the words settle against her like cold rain. Behind them, the bulldozer started again. At noon, she drove into Cedar Hollow and stopped at Ruthie's Diner. She had no appetite, but she needed coffee and a place to sit where the walls did not creak with Ray's absence. The diner was crowded with men in seed caps and 2 PrairieVolt workers eating burgers at the counter. As Ellen stepped in, the talk softened, then changed shape. Dale Haskins sat in the corner booth. Careful. Boys, he said, loud enough for the room. Mrs. Whitaker might tell you that coffee pot's sitting on a buried river. A few people laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. Worse than that, casually. Ellen poured cream into her coffee until it turned pale and said nothing. On the wall above the pie case hung an old framed photograph from the flood of 1978. Brown water covered the road. Fence posts poked up like broken teeth, and in the distance, barely visible, the Whitaker windmill stood on a small rise surrounded by water, still upright. Ellen stared at it until Ruthie touched her shoulder. You all right, honey? Ellen nodded, though she was not. When she got home, an envelope from First Flint Bank waited in the mailbox. She opened it standing beside the road. 60 days. If the overdue balance was not paid, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Ellen looked from the letter to the south pasture, where the bulldozer kept pushing dirt toward the cottonwood. For the first time, she wondered if everybody else was right, and if Ray's secret was about to cost her the farm. That night, the farmhouse felt smaller than it ever had before. The kitchen light buzzed softly above the table, while Ellen sat alone with the foreclosure letter beside her coffee cup. Outside, wind pressed against the windows, hard enough to rattle the loose frame above the sink. She read the notice again anyway. 60 days. The number sat in her chest like a stone. By morning, Luke was back. He found her in the barn, trying to lift an old fuel can into the back of the pickup. What are you doing? He asked. Selling some equipment. You can barely lift that. I managed before you got here. Luke took the can from her without another word and set it in the truck. His eyes moved across the barn, stopping at the old Ford 8N beneath the tarp. You thinking about selling that too? Ellen looked away. Maybe. Luke stared at her in disbelief. Dad loved that tractor more than half the people in this county. He loved keeping the farm more. The words hurt both of them. Luke climbed into the truck bed and began sorting through rusted tools, chains, and old fence stretchers. Ellen worked beside him in silence until he picked up a dented wooden box from beneath the workbench. When he lifted it, a rain of old square nails spilled across the barn floor. Damn it, he muttered. Ellen bent to help gather them. Then she froze. Beneath the dust and scattered nails, scratched directly into the concrete floor, were words Luke had never seen before. Line runs under cottonwood. The letters were rough, cut deep enough to survive decades of boots and tractor tires. Luke frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Ellen said nothing. Her heartbeat had quickened. Ray had carved reminders everywhere when he worked. Short notes, measurements, warnings, but she had not seen those words in years. She thought the dust and time had hidden them for good. Luke brushed dirt away with his boot. Is this about the pasture? Leave it alone. Mom. I said leave it. Luke straightened slowly. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You know something, but instead of explaining it, you act like everybody else is stupid. Ellen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because the terrible thing was, she did know something. Or at least she feared she did. Luke stepped toward the old workbench. You've been hiding things since Dad died. That is not fair. No, then tell me why you almost panic every time somebody mentions that south field. Ellen looked toward the barn door. Outside, the cottonwood tree moved slowly in the wind. She remembered Ray standing beneath it in muddy boots after the flood of 78 rainwater dripping from his sleeves while he pointed at the ground and said, "If that line ever closes, this whole hill's gonna hold water like a bathtub." Back then, they had been too broke to call engineers. Too broke for permits. Too broke for mistakes. Luke picked up the foreclosure notice from the workbench and shook it lightly. PrairieVolt's offer would solve this. You could stay in the house. You could breathe again. Ellen stared at the paper. For one dangerous moment, she almost agreed. Maybe the ground had settled over the years. Maybe Ray had been wrong. Maybe she had spent so long holding on to his fears that they had become her own. Without another word, she crossed the barn to the old wall cabinet beside the window. Her hand trembled as she unlocked it with the brass key. Inside sat a narrow metal tool chest covered in dust. Luke watched quietly now. Ellen lifted the lid. There was no money inside, no deed, no hidden savings bond. Only a folded piece of yellow paper. The handwriting on the outside belonged to Ray. If you open the board, you better be ready to tell them why I buried it. Luke looked up slowly. The board, he whispered. Ellen closed her eyes. Because after 6 years of silence, she finally understood something worse than losing the farm. If she showed people what Ray had hidden, Cedar Hollow might never look at his name the same way again. For a long while, neither of them moved. The barn held its breath around them. Dust floated in the late afternoon light. Outside, the PrairieVolt machines groaned across the south field, but inside, all Luke could hear was the old paper trembling in his mother's hand. What did Dad bury? He asked. Ellen did not answer right away. She walked to the far corner of the barn where the cedar board leaned beneath the canvas tarp. Her fingers curled around the edge of the cloth. For 6 years, she had kept it covered. For 6 years, she had told herself that silence was a kind of loyalty. Then she pulled the tarp away. The board was nearly 4 feet wide, dark with age, its surface covered in burned lines, carved marks, small circles, and words cut by Ray Whitaker's hand. It was not pretty. It was not official. But it held the shape of the land more honestly than any printed map Ellen had ever seen. Luke stepped closer. There was the farmhouse and the barn, the creek, the cottonwood, the windmill, the low south pasture, and beneath it all, like veins under skin, Ray had carved narrow lines for old water runs. Some were marked with dates, some with crosses. 3 circles near the cottonwood were labeled stone wells. Luke swallowed. Those are under PrairieVolt's site. One of them. Ellen touched the deepest circle with 2 fingers, this one. Luke looked from the board to his mother. Why didn't you tell anybody? Her face changed then, not with anger, with the kind of pain that had been folded away so long it had taken the shape of silence. Because your father covered it. Luke stared at her. Ellen kept her eyes on the board. In 78, after the drought broke, the rain came so hard the creek jumped its banks. That old well opened in the pasture, not all at once, just enough to drop a heifer clean through the crust. Luke said nothing. We were broke, bank was already circling, county would have fined us, maybe condemned that section. Ray said if we lost that pasture, we'd lose the whole farm. So he just filled it in. With stone, timber, clay, everything he had. He opened the north relief ditch so the water had somewhere to go. Then he carved this so we'd never forget where the danger was. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't report it. No. That's a hazard. Mom? I know. If someone gets hurt, I know. The words cracked in her throat. For the first time, Luke saw not a stubborn old woman fighting progress, but a widow standing guard over the mistake of the man she still loved. Ellen reached for a carved line running from the cottonwood toward a shallow depression north of the field. This is the ditch. PrairieVolt's temporary road cut across it last week. If that line stays closed and we get a hard rain, water will back up under the pad. Luke studied the board more carefully now. The pattern made terrible sense. "Let me take a picture," he said. Ellen looked up sharply. "No. Mom, they need to see this. They'll say your father lied. They'll drag his name through a county meeting like he was some careless fool." Luke's voice softened, "Or they'll know he left a warning." Ellen turned away. A few minutes later, she nodded once. Luke took photos of the cedar board, the carved wells, the ditch line, and Ray's note. Then he drove straight to the PrairieVolt trailer. Calvin Price met him outside, still wearing his hard hat. Luke showed him everything. Calvin's expression changed as he enlarged the photo on the phone. Not fear. Not yet. Suspicion. "If this is accurate," Calvin said slowly, "then your family knew about an unreported subsurface hazard for decades." Luke felt the blood leave his face. Behind him, the bulldozer pushed another load of dirt across the old ditch line. And for the first time, Ellen's warning had become evidence against her. PrairieVolt stopped work the next morning. For 1 hour. 2 engineers walked the edge of the south field with tablets in their hands and clean boots sinking lightly into the clay. They studied Luke's photos, checked their own survey points, and tapped at screens while Ellen stood on her side of the fence, waiting for someone to look at the ground instead of the numbers. Calvin Price arrived with Marla Jennings a little after 9. He was not smiling now. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "we reviewed the images your son provided." Ellen held the fence wire with one gloved hand, then moved the pad. "We can't make that decision based on a handmade board." "It's not art, Mr. Price. It's a warning." One of the engineers cleared his throat. "The marked well location appears to be east of our primary battery pad. It may be near the staging area, but not directly under the foundation zone." "Maybe Ellen asked." The engineer did not answer. Calvin stepped in. "We're going to proceed cautiously. Additional compaction monitoring will be done as equipment moves through. That ditch needs open before the rain." Marla frowned. "What rain?" Ellen looked toward the western sky, the kind that comes when the air smells like tin. Dale Haskins, standing near his truck at the road, gave a dry laugh. "Well, now she's forecasting by smell." Nobody laughed loudly this time, but a few mouths twitched. Luke stood beside the gate, jaw tight. Calvin's patience was thinning. "Mrs. Whitaker, with respect, we are days behind schedule. Every delay affects contractors, leaseholders, county revenue, and power commitments. And every shortcut affects the ground. Our responsibility is to build safely using verifiable information. Then verify the ditch." He glanced at the scraped earth where the temporary access road crossed the old drainage line. "That road is needed for equipment." "It's blocking the hill." "The hill is stable." "No," Ellen said. "The hill is waiting." A silence fell. Then Calvin asked the question Ellen had feared. "If your family knew about buried wells and unstable ground, why was it never reported?" Luke looked at his mother. Marla looked down at her folder. Ellen felt the whole pasture tilt beneath her, not from water or hollow earth, but from the weight of Ray's name standing exposed in daylight. "Because we were wrong not to," she said. It was the closest thing to confession she could give. Calvin's expression softened for half a second, then hardened again under the pressure of his job. "We'll document that statement." Ellen nodded once as if she had expected the blow. By late afternoon, the machines were moving again. The bulldozer packed more gravel over the temporary road. A drilling rig crawled toward the staging area. Men in reflective vests shouted over backup alarms. The old ditch line disappeared beneath fresh stone and clay. Luke stayed at the fence long after everyone else left. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For showing him the photos." Ellen shook her head. Truth does what truth does. He looked at her. "Do you still think something's going to happen?" She watched a blackbird lift from the cottonwood and vanish into the restless sky. "I think your father carved that board for a reason." Near sunset, Amos Bell's pickup rattled into the driveway. The old man stepped out holding a faded photograph sealed in a plastic sleeve. It showed Ray Whitaker after the flood of 1978 standing beside the windmill with mud to his knees, one arm raised toward the cottonwood. On the back, in Ray's handwriting, were 7 words. "When the ditch opens, the hill breathes." Ellen read them twice. Then the weather radio inside the kitchen crackled to life. A storm cell was building west of Cedar Hollow, moving fast across the plains, with the heaviest rainfall the county had seen in years. Ellen looked toward the south pasture. Around the cottonwood roots, the dirt was already dark with water. The storm reached Cedar Hollow just after midnight. It came hard and low across the prairie, throwing rain against the farmhouse windows until the glass looked alive. Thunder rolled over the fields in long, heavy waves. The old windmill screamed on its tower, spinning faster than Ellen had heard it spin in years. She was already dressed. Luke found her in the mudroom pulling on Ray's old rain slicker. "You're not going out there," he said. Ellen took the brass key from the hook. "I am." "Mom, the creek's already rising." "That's why I'm going." A flash of lightning lit the south pasture white. Beyond the fence, PrairieVolt's work lights glowed through sheets of rain. Men shouted near the staging area. One of the big drilling rigs had stopped moving, its tracks buried deep in wet clay. A diesel pump coughed somewhere in the dark. Then came a sound Ellen had not heard since 1978, a low, hollow groan beneath the hill. Luke heard it too. His face changed. They ran to the barn. The old Ford 8N sat under its tarp, dusty and tired, with one tire still low and the blade attachment leaning beside it like a forgotten tool from another lifetime. Luke grabbed her arm. "That tractor hasn't pulled anything in years." "It's light," Ellen said. "That's why Ray kept it. It might not start. Then we'll know soon enough." She turned the key. The engine coughed once. Twice. Then the old tractor shook itself awake, rattling so hard the hood trembled under the rain hammering the roof. Luke stared at it like he had just heard his father answer from the grave. Ellen climbed onto the seat. "Hook the blade." They worked in the storm, hands slipping, boots sinking, metal cold enough to burn. By the time Luke secured the last pin, water was running through the barnyard in twisting brown ribbons. Ellen drove toward the south pasture with Luke walking beside her, one hand holding a flashlight, the other clutching Ray's cedar board wrapped in plastic. "At the fence!" Calvin Price shouted through the rain. "Mrs. Whitaker, stay back, the ground's unstable." "That's what I've been telling you." The words vanished under thunder. Ahead, the staging area had begun to fail. The drilling rig leaned at an ugly angle, one side sunk nearly to the axle. Brown water boiled up beside it, carrying bubbles and bits of rotten timber. A circle was forming in the mud. The old well was opening. Ellen did not drive toward it. She drove north, following the memory of a ditch that no longer showed itself to anyone who had not known it before it disappeared. Luke swept the flashlight across the board. 10 yards past the cottonwood, he yelled. "I know." The tractor slid once, then caught. Behind them, Amos Bell arrived in his pickup, followed by Dale Haskins and 2 more neighbors who had laughed at the diner. Nobody said anything. They just came running with shovels. Ellen lowered the blade. The Ford 8N bit into the packed gravel of PrairieVolt's temporary road. The little tractor strained, engine knocking, tires spitting mud. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the blade tore through. Water surged forward like it had been waiting 40 years to be invited. It cut into the old North Relief ditch, first as a trickle, then as a rush, then as a roaring brown channel that pulled the pressure away from the battery pad and down toward the safe basin beyond the rise. The ground stopped groaning. The boiling water near the rig slowed. Calvin stood in the rain, speechless. Ellen kept driving until the ditch ran clear enough to breathe. Only then did the Ford 8N give one final cough and die beneath her. In the sudden quiet after the thunder, Luke helped her down. At the edge of the broken mud, the circle of old stones had appeared. The well Ray buried was back in the open. And this time, the whole town could see it. By morning, the storm had moved east, leaving Cedar Hollow under a pale, washed-out sky. The south pasture looked like a battlefield made of mud. Tire tracks were filled with brown water. Gravel had been torn open where the old ditch now ran free. The drilling rig still leaned near the failed staging pad, chained to 2 recovery trucks that had not yet dared pull it loose. And beside it, half uncovered in the clay, lay the old stone well. No one laughed when they saw it. The county inspector arrived before 8. He wore rubber boots, carried a clipboard, and said very little. Behind him came Marla Jennings, Calvin Price, 2 PrairieVolt engineers, and half a dozen locals who pretended they had only stopped by because the road was open again. Ellen stood near the fence with Luke beside her. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee thermos, but she had not taken a drink. Calvin walked slowly around the exposed stones. The circle was too even to dismiss, too old to explain away, and too close to the battery pad for comfort. One of the engineers crouched near the edge and pulled a piece of blackened timber from the mud. He looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at Ellen. For once, there was no presentation ready in his eyes. "You were right," he said. Ellen did not answer. Maybe because she had waited too long to hear it. Maybe because being right had not felt like victory. The inspector marked the site unsafe pending further geotechnical review. PrairieVolt work was suspended indefinitely. The temporary road had to be removed. The north relief ditch had to remain open until a formal drainage plan could be approved. Word spread through Cedar Hollow before lunch. At Ruthie's diner, people spoke softer when Ellen's name came up. Dale Haskins sat in his usual corner booth and stared into his coffee for a long time. He did not apologize that day. Men like Dale sometimes needed a little while to find the shape of the words. But the town's silence did not protect Ellen from what came next. 3 days later, the county called a public meeting. This time, the Grange Hall felt different. No bright slides, no clean digital maps, just folding chairs, muddy boots, and raised cedar board resting on 2 sawhorses at the front of the room. Ellen stood beside it with Luke close behind her. Calvin sat in the second row. Marla sat near the aisle with a legal pad in her lap. Amos Bell leaned on his cane by the wall. The county inspector explained the findings first. The buried well was real. The old water runs were real. The blocked relief ditch had contributed to the pressure under the site. PrairieVolt's instruments had missed portions of the hazard because the ground had been filled and altered decades earlier. Then he said the sentence Ellen had been dreading. There is also the question of why this feature was not reported when it was originally covered. The room turned toward her. Ellen looked at the cedar board. Ray's carved lines seemed darker under the fluorescent lights. "My husband filled that well in 1978, she said. Her voice was steady but quiet. We were young. We were broke. We had cattle to feed, a note at the bank, and more fear than sense. He thought he was protecting us. No one moved. He was wrong not to report it." Luke lowered his eyes. Ellen swallowed. But he wasn't careless. He opened that ditch. He marked every line he knew. He carved this board so somebody would remember what the land was hiding. She laid one hand on the wood. "I kept it covered because I didn't want this town thinking less of him." For a long moment, there was only the hum of the lights. Then Amos Bell tapped his cane once against the floor. Not applause. Just witness. Calvin stood slowly. Every head turned. "PrairieVolt will redesign the site," he said, "and Mrs. Whitaker, if she's willing, we would like her help understanding the land before we put another machine on it." Ellen looked at him, then at Luke. The offer did not erase the damage, but it opened a door. PrairieVolt did not leave Cedar Hollow. That surprised some people. A few expected lawyers, threats, maybe a quiet attempt to blame the Whitakers for everything that had gone wrong. But Calvin Price stayed. For 2 weeks, he walked the pasture in rubber boots instead of polished work shoes, carrying Ray's cedar board under one arm and a county drainage map under the other. He stopped calling it an unverified artifact. He called it the Whitaker map. The battery storage site was moved to higher ground, nearly a quarter-mile north, where the soil held firm and the grass did not grow too green in dry weather. The north relief ditch was reopened permanently, lined with stone, and added to the county drainage record. Around the exposed well, PrairieVolt installed a low wooden fence and a small warning sign. Ellen did not ask for the sign. She did not like looking at it, but she understood why it had to be there. First, Flint Bank received its overdue payment before the end of the month. PrairieVolt hired Ellen as a local land consultant, though she hated the title and refused to buy new clothes for meetings. The check was enough to stop the foreclosure, patch the worst part of the barn roof, and keep hay in the shed through winter. It was not enough to make the farm easy. Nothing ever had been. Luke stayed longer than he planned. He fixed the porch steps, replaced the cracked window above the sink, and spent 3 full Saturdays working on the barn with Dale Haskins, who showed up one morning with a nail gun and a quiet apology tucked somewhere under his cap. He never made a speech. He just said, "I was wrong about the coffee pot." Ellen looked at him for a moment, then handed him a hammer. That was enough. The old Ford 8N did not recover from the storm. Luke tried everything, but the engine had given all it had left in that muddy field. Ellen stood beside it in the barn while he wiped his hands on a rag and tried to explain what parts they would need. She shook her head. Let it rest. So they cleaned the mud from its tires, covered it with Ray's canvas tarp, and parked it where the morning light could still find the hood. The cedar board no longer stayed hidden in the corner. Ellen hung it on the barn wall, not like a trophy, but like a window. Sometimes Calvin brought young engineers to see it. Sometimes school children came with clipboards and questions. Ellen answered the practical ones and ignored the foolish ones. One afternoon, Luke found her standing beneath it alone. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Your father would have hated all this attention. He also would have liked being right." A small smile touched her face, then faded into something softer. "He wasn't right about everything." Luke stepped beside her. "Neither are we." Outside, the windmill turned slowly over the pasture. The farm still had debt. The barn still leaned. Rain still made Ellen look toward the south field before she looked anywhere else. But the creek ran clear again. The ditch held, and no one in Cedar Hollow called that ground empty anymore. On quiet mornings, Ellen still walked the fence line with coffee in one hand and pliers in the other. Only now, when she stopped near the cottonwood, she did not feel like she was guarding a secret. She felt like she was keeping a promise in the open. Some stories do not end with everything fixed. Sometimes the roof still leaks, the bills still come. The old wounds do not close just because the truth finally gets spoken out loud, but there's a kind of peace in being seen clearly, especially after years of being misunderstood. Ellen Whitaker was not trying to stop the future. She was trying to keep people from building it on top of something dangerous, something forgotten, something the land had been warning about all along. And maybe that is why stories like this stay with us. Because most of us have known someone like Ellen. Someone quiet, someone stubborn, someone who carried more than they explained. Someone people laughed at until the day everybody realized they had been listening to the wrong voices. Maybe it was a grandfather who knew the weather by the smell of the wind. Maybe it was a mother who saved every receipt because she had lived through hard times. Maybe it was an old neighbor who understood a road, a creek, a field, or a machine better than any expert passing through ever could. If this story reminded you of someone, write about them in the comments. Tell us who they were, what they taught you, and whether people understood them while they were still here. And if you have not already, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It is always powerful to see how far these small-town stories travel. If this story moved you, gave you something to think about, or reminded you of the kind of wisdom that does not always come with a title, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories from the heart of rural America. Until the next story, take care of your people, listen before you judge, and never forget that sometimes the old ground remembers what the rest of us have buried. Script completed. Some of the most valuable people in this world are the ones who rarely raise their voices. The quiet father who keeps fixing things nobody notices. The mother who carries worry without ever asking for sympathy. The old farmer who understands the land better than any modern report ever could. Life has a way of making wisdom look ordinary until the day that wisdom is the only thing left standing when everything else fails. And maybe that is the lesson worth holding on to. Never be too quick to dismiss people simply because they move slower, speak softer, or come from a different time. Experience earned through hardship carries a kind of truth that no shortcut can replace. Sometimes the people who seem stuck in the past are actually the ones protecting the future from mistakes nobody else can see yet. If this story reminded you of someone you love or someone you wish you had listened to sooner, share their story in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. These stories mean more when people from different towns, farms, and walks of life come together around them. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about rural America, quiet strength, and hard-earned wisdom, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.